Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, a series of videos where I teach you all about painting miniatures from start to finish and everything in between, including using sponges for weathering. So this is part 123, weathering items using a sponge. And this is a great way of reusing the sponges that come with your miniatures to protect them. So today we will be weathering this piece of terrain. It's an Imperial Bastion, and I just used it for an airbrush tutorial. And now it's time to weather it slightly with some metallics and a little bit of rust using the sponge. As I said, it's just a typical sponge that you would typically find protecting your miniatures when you buy them from any major company. Games Workshop uses them. I know a bunch of other companies, Private Press uses them. So today we'll be using this sponge. As I said, it's just a normal sponge, and it's a great way of reusing them, so you actually get to use them in things. And as you can see, it's just a nice texture to it. But of course, it is too plain at the moment. We're not going to just sponge paint onto it, because then it'll just look like it was sponged. So the first thing you got to do is modify the sponge that you're going to use. So we're going to take our needle nose pliers that are bent, and we're just going to remove chunks a little bit at a time to create a little bit of a pattern. As you see, just an uneven, an unbalanced pattern of sponge in the corner. And I'm going to do this repeatedly along the edge of it. So we'll speed it up slightly. I'm just going to repeat this process along the entire, just along that corner of the sponge. And that way it is nice and uneven, because you don't want it to be even. You don't want it to look like it's just a sponge texture. You want it to be an uneven pattern, and that way it'll create really, to almost like the weathering that you want it to be. You want it to be an uneven pattern and just look like the paint has been rubbing off on the material. So as you can see, just repeatedly removing just small sections at a time with my pliers and whittling it down slightly, so that way it's an uneven pattern along the corner of the sponge. Now we're going to take some Leadbelcher paint and we're going to put it in our paint palette, and then of course put it onto our sponge. So first we'll take our paint, put a little bit into our palette, just using a brush. And the key is you don't want to use a lot of paint. You don't want the sponge to absorb a lot of it, so you just want to dab just a little bit onto the sponge and get a bit onto the corner, and then we're just going to dab it off so that we can remove a lot of the excess from the sponge onto a piece of, in this case, a paper towel. And now we're going to apply it to the piece of terrain. So the key is just choose what areas you really want it to apply, and then sponge it on lightly, a little bit at a time, and then add more as you go. And I like to do it along edges, along just the very edges of things, and along the front of the miniature, along the very bottom of it, areas that the paint would most likely chip off. And this is going to create a very heavy chipping effect, because as you can see, just the sponge in random patterns really does create a really nice heavy chipping effect along these areas. And I just like to pick areas that would have a lot of wear and tear, so just along the edges, as you can see, or parts that would be along the ground, parts that the soldiers would be most likely rubbing it off. So let's keep going, and I'll add a little bit heavier to my liking. This is what happens if you do just a little bit heavier of a pattern, but as you see, I'm just sponging on unevenly, and it's because of that textured pattern that we created with our tool that you get a nice heavy chippy appearance on the piece of terrain. And you can apply this to tanks and even some miniatures you can if you want to do it small enough. But as you see, I'm just going to weather it unevenly. The key is just uneven. You don't want it to be a nice normal pattern. You want it to just be uneven, because it will build up more in some areas than others. And after you're done with one color, you of course go to your next lightest color. So in this case, I'm going to use Ironbreaker, because Ironbreaker, we're going to repeat this process, but it's going to reflect more of the newer chips. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of Ironbreaker to our sponge, a lot less than the previous step, and then I'm going to go back to the areas in which I sponged the first time, and I'm going to add a little bit of Ironbreaker to each one, or just some of them basically. But I don't want to create any new patches with the Ironbreaker. I just want to add to existing patches, because this will reflect, as I said, the more newer scratches and wear on the piece of terrain. Versus the older ones, which will be darker and dirtier, and they'll be through the Leadbelcher. So as you can see, I'm just adding a little bit, and with each step you want to go lighter and lighter with the amount of paint on your sponge, as well as the lighter that you want to dab the sponge onto the piece of terrain. And then finally, we're going to do a little bit of rust. You can do rust, you can do dirt. So I'm going to add a little bit of Evil Sunz Scarlet to Ironbreaker, so it's a 1-1 mix. And now I'm just doing very, very light dabs of this combination onto surfaces existing. Now, if you find yourself going too heavy like I did right there, you can just take the opposite side of the sponge like I'm doing now, the dry side, and just dab it back, and it will end up bringing it back to a more realistic tone. And you can just add a little bit of this combination, so it's a 1-1 mix of Ironbreaker and Evil Sunz Scarlet, and adds a little bit of a rust into these areas to make them even look dirtier and more older and rustic. And you can do the same thing if you want to do it with a brown tone, and it'll just add more dirt into these areas. And you can use this sponge technique to not only create a heavy chipping effect, but a weathering effect as well, or a rusting effect or dirty effect. And as you can see, after a few minutes of doing this, we've created a nice worn out piece of terrain. It has a very heavy chipping effect and some rust. And as I said, you can do the same if you want with dirt, but it's just the key is to create the subtle variations on the sponge and go lightly a little bit of color at a time, going from the darkest silver to a lightest silver, or you want to do reds and or browns to weather it even more. So as always, thank you so much for watching this episode of Miniature Painting 101. I really hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for next week's episode, part 124, which is just around the corner. But if you don't want to wait for next week, check out The Warp. Click on the link below for a free 14-day trial to my premium YouTube channel. We're not even going to see the next 6 months worth of Miniature Painting 101 episodes before anyone else. Get to see over 100 start-to-finish painting tutorials, battle reports, face-off episodes, and Airbrush 101 series. Just some awesome wargaming content which helps support my videos. So thank you as always for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.